Do you have any advice for people who dread networking events?
Very often we think about networking as about us making connections, but how do you make that connection?
SuYen Wong is a board chairman and leadership professor.
It seems like a very glamorous thing to sit on a board. Is it really?
I think people have that perception, but really it's a lot of responsibility.
You advised on the salaries of the Prime Minister, the President, other political holders.
One of the things that's really important when you're looking at how you pay anyone is you need to look at,
From your point of view, what is the leadership that Singapore needs now?
it's really critical for leaders in Singapore and of organizations to really be.
SuYen, can you tell me what your superpower is in one sentence?
My superpower is I connect people and ideas to enable possibilities.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, part of it is because I straddle multiple domains, and I've had the wonderful privilege of having worked across different industries, different geographies, across lots of different aspects. I guess I have quite an expansive view of the kind of issues that one might face, and also an expansive network of people that I interact with on a regular basis. So connecting people sometimes from different spheres actually helps them really do quite a lot of magic when you put it together.
Was there a specific example or situation where you connected two people who never would have met and gotten a huge opportunity if not for you?
I literally just last night, I connected two people, one who's based in the US, one who's based here, for an opportunity that may materialize and be very impactful for both of them. One is an academic institution, the other one has got a software platform for mentoring, and their paths likely would not have intersected. But if I have enough context about what each party brings to the table, I can kind of say, okay, well, I think there might be something there. And then you connect the dots, and then, again, as I mentioned, magic happens.
Yeah. I'm always very amazed by people who say they are connectors. And I think in your case, you're a super connector, because I look at myself and I think I'm very maybe sheltered or isolated in what I do, because I spend so much time in the media industry, and that's my world. I know very few people outside of it. But now as I started my business, I'm starting to meet other people in different industries, especially the finance industry. But it's still not wide enough. So I think I feel quite impressed and amazed at people who can connect. How do you meet so many people of different areas and backgrounds?
Having depth is also a gift, right? So many executives, I think, do come up through the ranks and they get to be very successful precisely because they have depth. They're an expert in marketing, they're an expert in sustainability, they're an expert in a particular industry, media, financial services, whatever it is. And that depth actually propels people to a certain level. For people who want to reinvent themselves, it's actually quite difficult to move out of that sphere when you've spent, 10, 20, 30 years in that particular domain. So how do you get out of it? Well, actually, it's by meeting different types of people in different kinds of communities. One of the things that I often tell people, for example, who might show up at a Singapore Institute of Directors event, for example, and they may say, well, I don't really know these people. I said, well, that's a good thing. It means that you're expanding your network. Or somebody who moves into a new community and say, well, everybody here is kind of new to me. Again, that's a good thing. So I think it's by getting uncomfortable with not knowing people in the room as we think about how we reinvent and sort of expand ourselves. Meeting new people is sort of like discovering a whole new world. It's sort of like, if you spend your time growing up in a particular country and all of a sudden you travel to another country, oh wow, there are people who do things differently.
I really like what you said, especially about meeting a lot of different people. And that's what I know most people fear when they go for a networking event. It's all these people I don't know, they're from different industries. And the first instinct is to feel fearful. Do you have any advice for people who dread networking events and feel fearful when there's so many faces that they don't know?
That's such a great question, because I think very often when we go into a networking event or a lunch or something, we're looking for people that we are familiar with. Like, who's the familiar face so I can go say hi to a friendly face, right? That's comfortable. Very often we think about networking as about us making connections, but how do you make that connection? It's actually by asking people questions like, what's keeping you busy these days? as opposed to what do you do or where do you work. And that gives people sort of the opening to tell you about themselves. And I think by being interested in what other people are saying, that's actually how we build relationships with people that we might not know.
A lot of people, when they go into a networking event, they feel that fear, right? And that nervousness, and their own guard comes up. And I've had a client, and I always quote him, and he knows when I'm quoting him. He says, I walked in, I see like a wall of people.
Yeah.
And then I had another, someone I was speaking to, and she said, oh, so how do I do it? And I gave her some questions to prepare herself. She said, oh, so I have to arm myself with these questions. And I always tell them, if that's how you see it, a wall of people, you are making it hard
got
for yourself.
defenses
yeah,
up.
your
Yes.
defenses up, and have to arm myself. You're seeing it like a battleground.
Yes.
So even the language you use before you go for the event, you got to be very mindful of it and look at it as a place where you might meet someone who's so interesting. Then that becomes something you focus on doing instead of, oh, I'm alone and people are here to judge me.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of strategies, like you said.
A lot of people are uncomfortable meeting new people. So if we're sort of in a crowd or a circle, even the way you stand can make it more welcoming for another person to come in, right? So like which way you angle your body. So I think for somebody that's in the middle of a conversation, be mindful of other people as well who might be trying to join the conversation. That really helps.
Yes, another thing that I advise my clients to do, and he said, how do you even break into a conversation? And I said, it can be daunting, but one simple thing is to look for the stray person standing alone by themselves, and you go up and talk to them. They'll be so grateful that you start a conversation with them. That's the easiest.
And everyone has a story.
Yes.
Everyone has something interesting going on in their life, right? So
Yes.
I think you can always find somebody to have a conversation with.
And many people are nervous too, so remember
Yes,
that.
Exactly.
So you've sat on the boards of many different companies. You've been like board member, board director, chairman of the board. Someone who wants to be, in this role, be a board member. What do they need to do?
I would say the first thing is prepare. I used to think mistakenly that, as you ascend into sort of senior leadership ranks, that you could just kind of slide seamlessly into a board role. But actually, I've come to appreciate that actually it's a profession unto itself. So think of it that way and think about how you learn about what that entails. And there are all kinds of courses and stuff you can do to help you in that journey. The second thing that I would say that's really important is to actually practice. Because when you know that it's a profession, we don't get to anywhere overnight, right? So getting the opportunity to start with maybe a smaller organization, maybe even supporting a startup that might need some advisory help as a non-executive, that really helps get you started on that journey. And then I think over time, really be prepared to make difficult decisions. I think as a director, we are particularly there to solve for issues that have no clear answer. I would say it's a balance between understanding the technical aspects of what you need to know with having the courage and the judgment to apply that knowledge in different situations.
It seems like a very glamorous thing to sit on a board. Is it really?
I think people have that perception, but really it's a lot of responsibility because as a board, you're responsible for ensuring sustainability of the overall organization. And that means how do you ensure that, particularly in this day and age, the company is agile, it's flexible, it's able to withstand geopolitical shocks, financial shocks, technology shocks to be able to survive into the future. And actually, many companies are going through a really tough time. If you look sort of 5, 10, 15 years out, how do you ensure that the company is able to transform and survive in that new era? That's actually not easy. Don't look at the titles, I would say. Don't look at the glamour, but really look at what is it that one can contribute to the organization. At the end of the day, we talk about serving on a board because I do think of it as service. It's about how you actually lead an organization through change to be able to drive performance, to be able to have an impact.
Leadership is a very broad topic. It's a very important topic. Firstly, how do you see leadership evolving in Asia? And then secondly, how can Asians evolve to take more of those roles?
Glad you asked that question. For some years, I was actually helming a leadership institute, which had as its mandate, how do you help Asians lead in both a regional and global stage? And I think when you look at, particularly fast forward to where we are today, and how the center of gravity is shifting, you would expect to see shifts in what constitutes leadership. If you go into Amazon and you Google leadership books, you get hundreds and thousands of books, literally. However, the vast majority of them are written from a Western lens. And it's actually very difficult to pull apart the notion of leadership from the cultural context that we come from, because every culture has its nuances. And by the way, cultures evolve as well, of course. I think when you move into a multi-geography, multicultural kind of an environment, or one where you're working with people, whether they're customers, suppliers, or employees across different borders, it's really important to be able to flex that style, to understand what those differences are, and to be able to adapt accordingly. We've got so many cross-cultural teams. When you layer on virtual on top of that, it gets really complex, right? So I think leadership is evolving in terms of what's effective leadership. If somebody has sort of a Western cultural concept, and again, there is no generic Western concept because Germans and French are completely different, for example, right? So one has a particular worldview. It's just as important to understand the other side, just like there is no Asian context, right? Japanese and Thais are, and Filipinos are completely different, right? So understanding how to cross over is really critical to how we think of leadership moving forward.
So many factors are involved. A leader in what kind of company? Base where, who are the people, even the industry, because different industries
Absolutely.
are different. So it's not a one size fits all. It's not a textbook. It's not even a playbook. There's so many nuances at play here. Looking at the context today, because Asians, right, we tend to be more compliant, if that's the right word, obedient, because that's what we're brought up with. And speaking up is not really the thing to do, because, the way I grew up, when the boss said something, that's right. You don't question it. You just shut up and do what he says. But today, I see bosses, and I think around the world, maybe definitely the culture is shifting, that they become very considerate about the people who are under their charge, and they want to make sure that everyone's mental health is okay, and things, they feel good and they feel comfortable. It's kind of like switch the other way, that before you got to do things to please the boss, but now the boss needs to do things to please the direct reports. For someone who wants to be a leader, but yet their style may not suit serving in that way of making sure everyone's okay before I am. How would you address this?
There are different contexts where different things, different ways of leading might be more versus less effective. So, for example, in a crisis situation, right, things just need to get done. Right, there's a fire raging. Right? You have an emergency in your hands. That probably requires a very different leadership style than one where you're trying to drive consensus and build a culture in an organization. So I would say it's important to have multiple tools in our toolkit so that we actually know which to use at which point in time. I would also say that there's a big part of it which is around helping leaders understand what those tools are. Because, the saying about how if I'm a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If I only have this hammer in my toolkit and I'm not aware that there are other tools that I can use, I might not know or might not recognize a situation where I need a different tool. Therefore, I think giving leaders an awareness, so this is where leadership development and training comes in, of what those situations might be, perhaps even what kind of cultural context they might be faced, in terms of what kinds of situations demand what types of approaches to be most effective. Different generations in the workforce, again, this is a little bit generic because, again, I wouldn't say that everyone who's a Gen X behaves the same way, just like not everybody in Gen Y behaves the same. But if you use that as kind of a bit of an oversimplification, different generations prefer different types of forms of communication and different ways of working and relating to their managers as well. So the onus actually is on us as leaders to recognize what's going to drive performance. I've always focused on, I have a particular outcome that I'm trying to drive to. What is it that's going to help me get to that outcome? There may be lots of different ways to get there, but depending on the situation, depending on the person or the people that I'm working with, I might choose different paths. The important thing is how to accomplish that outcome. So sometimes it might mean being more directive. Sometimes it means much more influencing. Sometimes is letting people feel that they came up with the idea, right? So there are lots of different ways to get to that desired outcome.
What are some of those tools that people can start being aware of?
So one I would say is to understand the different dimensions of culture. I find that that's actually a really useful way to think about the people's work styles. So you've got different dimensions that you can look at. Actually, there's a tool that I use to assess people in terms of where they are. Egalitarian versus hierarchical being one of those particular dimensions. But if you understand work styles, that's absolutely one aspect. I would say another aspect is to recognize and be able to have a very clear view of the organization context or the organization culture, because you're absolutely right that different organizations have different cultures and different aspects of leadership work more versus less effective, which is the reason why very often you see people who may be very successful in a particular company. They've had maybe a 20-year career, 15-year career in that particular company, done really, really well. So clearly they're doing something right? And then they move to a different company. Now, it's the same person, but they don't have the same success in that new company for whatever reason. 1-2 years and it no longer works and they leave, right? So why is it? It was the same person, right? It's because the environment changed and they were not able to adapt to that new environment. So I think the ability to read the environment and adapt, because, the environment's not going to adapt to us. We have to adapt to the environment, right?
I wonder what kind of leader I am becoming now, because obviously the way I led when I worked in a corporation was very different. It was a different, as you said, the environment. The corporation was, compliance was something that was important.
And it's organization specific as well. Yep.
Yes, and industry specific.
Yes.
I was told I was intimidating. And I liked it because I was driving for action and change.
Yep.
I think that style doesn't work now, definitely for not what I do. So I haven't had a chance to really fully flesh out how I'm becoming as a leader. But I'm very excited to see that journey, because I believe it always changes and evolves at every point in your life. And from what I gathered from what you said, it really is about a person's ability to adapt and change, because change is constant.
Yeah.
And if you don't change, then you're not going to have the successes you had even 3 years ago. You can't bring it into the present with you.
I love the word that you use, becoming, right? I mean, I think as human beings, we're always evolving, hopefully. I hope I'm not the same person as I was 25 years ago. That would be kind of sad. So, I think we're always evolving and becoming, right? Whatever that next thing is.
Anyone can actually learn to become a great leader.
I teach leadership. I mean, and some people say, how can you teach leadership? Is that, born, or is that sort of nurtured, right? Nature versus nurture. I think one of the aspects that's really important as leaders, and I've come to appreciate this over time, is we need to have a very clear sense of self. Because it's impossible to pull apart who we are as people from who we are as leaders. If you look at the way somebody leads, you're basically looking at the way that person is, right? So that does require a fair amount of introspection, self-reflection, hopefully getting good feedback along the way, some mentors along the way, some role models along the way, to sort of figure out, what am I, right? And again, as you mentioned, that changes over time. And, it's what am I at that particular point in time in my life and my career as well.
You advised on the salaries of the Prime Minister, the President, other political holders. And as the average person who doesn't know what goes on behind this, we think they might be paid a lot. Can you give us some clarity on how that computation is? I'm sure it's not a simple thing, it's very complex, but help us to understand.
The great thing about being in Singapore is that actually it's very transparent. The full report is available online publicly. So actually anybody can actually download the report and read it. One of the things that's really important when you're looking at how you pay anyone is you need to look at where you draw the talent from and who you lose the talent to. So if you are a let's say you are in a corporation and you're hiring people for a particular role and they tend to come from that particular industry, you compare against comparable roles in comparable organizations. Now, with politicians, a little bit more tricky. First of all, they have to be native right? So that's a pool that you're looking at. And then you have to look at what are the other options that such individuals might have had, perhaps in the private sector. So you're looking at what's the comparable pool of people. Beyond that, you're then saying, okay, but hang on, public service, at the end of the day, back to the point of service, there is a service component. So it's not necessarily benchmarking at the exact comparator level, but maybe there's a bit of a service discount. So there's that as well. So you look at what the appropriate benchmarks are for that particular economy. The other thing then we did was we really looked at what the performance indicators were, which sounds really interesting, right? Because how do you look at KPIs? It used to be that we would have what's called the GDP bonus, which means that basically as the GDP was increasing, it would translate into, well, this means that you're doing a great job as a politician, therefore you get a particular bonus. Well, one of the things about GDP is that it may or may not filter down throughout the overall economy and society. So one of the things that we did, for example, is look at different metrics. So for example, looking at the median income of households. And we looked at things like, how is the bottom 20 percentile improving? Of course, GDP is still a factor, but if you look at a much more nuanced view of what does success look like for the country, you start having a lot more balance in how we look at that. So, those are some of the aspects that I think are important. And then you start seeing that flow through. So if you look at programs that have been introduced in the decade or so since, I think a lot of them have really been about how do we uplift all portions of society as opposed to only looking at the net GDP growth lever.
It's looked at from many different angles, but there's still an emotional aspect to it. For a lot of people who feel that the standard of living has gone up, and they find it hard to make ends meet, and then they look at a particular group of politicians who make a lot of money, the most in the world. So I think the emotional element is something that's hard to dissipate, because when people feel something, they feel something, and no amount of logic can reduce that. What do you think a person who feels frustrated can focus on instead?
I think it's important to think about who we choose to lead, back to leadership, but then also what our expectations are of those leaders, both while they're in office and to some extent out of office. So I'll give you an example. When we looked at comparators, we looked at other countries as well. And in some other countries, the headline number looks much lower, to your point. However, what happens actually in many of those countries is that when somebody leaves office, they have a long tail of benefits that comes after that. There are also other aspects that don't show up in terms of their salary, but they have loads of benefits that you just don't see. So when you actually look at it in totality, it's actually not comparing apples to apples, right? Whereas here, basically politicians don't get pensions. They get CPF just like the rest of us. They don't get, any special medical insurance. You get the same as we do. To your point about the emotions that people might feel around this, I think that's one of the reasons why it's really important to have much more of a balanced scorecard, to focus on things like, how are we doing as a society with the bottom segment of society economically, because that should translate into programs that help uplift everyone. Now, perhaps, and you raised a good point, it's time to relook at what those metrics might be in 2025 and see what that looks like, because of course metrics do, you would hope, drive behavior, right? So maybe it's time for a refresh of those dimensions.
From your point of view, what is the leadership that Singapore needs now, the type of leadership, the type of leaders that we need now to take Singapore into the next 10 years and to continue to do as well, if not better?
Well, I suppose from a citizen perspective,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I think it comes back a little bit to the point that you raised earlier, which is around listening. And how as leaders, whether of a country or of an organization, we're attuned to either our employees or citizens in terms of their aspirations, their needs, their desires. And you made a comment earlier about how it seems like now as a manager you need to listen to what your staff are doing as opposed to the other way around. I kind of think it's analogous in terms of leadership of a country as well, to be in tune to the sentiments on the ground and what people are hoping for. But I think that's internal. If I use an organizational metaphor and continue that, I would say in an organization, as a leader, you want to be attuned to listening what's externally happening as well. So I think for a country, same thing. What's the external environment? How's that shifting? Be really attuned to that so that you can bring both the internal and external together. So I think, it's really critical for leaders in Singapore and of organizations to really have a really good sensing of and be listening.
The listening's important, but very often it depends on who you're listening to.
Sure.
And then are you in certain echo chambers, which happens to all of us.
It's about listening broadly. It's a little bit like where we started the conversation with having a broad network. In fact, it's kind of the same, right? When you have different types of people that you engage with, I think we start to see a much richer picture. So I don't only see, red and green, I see blue and yellow and orange, right? And be able to fill in the gaps. So in the same way is, if I hang out with lawyers all the time, I will have a particular view because that's a particular culture. If I layer onto that musicians, and I layer onto that, engineers, and I layer onto that people in the startup world and political people, then I start having a much more holistic picture. The proverbial fable about the blind man touching the elephant, right? So I can now fill in the dots and say, okay, this is truly the picture.
It's just easier for us as human beings to go to what we're comfortable with and speak to people we know or who are like us. And I think the challenge is really stepping out of comfort zone and be uncomfortable with hearing all these views that, don't seem alien to us.
I agree.
That's a challenge that I think many of us need to start accepting. Do you think you're successful?
I think success is a very subjective notion. The idea of success, I think, also for me, evolves, as I think it should, right? So early on in life, I think many of us, and I don't think I'm alone in this, we think of success in terms of career success. We think of monetary success, how you're earning, how you're progressing in an organization. But what I've come to appreciate actually is that probably the most precious asset that we have is our time. And so therefore, it's a question of what we want to trade that time for. Again, early in life, we trade that time for a job and a career. And that's how we measure our success in a way. But actually, that time can be traded for lots of other things. You can trade that time for health. You can trade that time for relationships. You can trade that time for learning. You can trade that time for fun and enjoyment and entertainment. So there are lots of things that we can trade that time for. And I think for me, success is much more about how I've learned to use that asset in different ways to create impact, positive impact of some sort in whatever domain I might be focusing on at that particular point in time. It might be about constructing, the sort of the 10 to 20 year view for the university that I'm chairing the board of. It might be, impacting somebody's life through mentoring them. So I think to me, success is really multifaceted because the one thing that I can trade is time in order to create that success.
I have found now that success really, for me at this point, is really about health. And if I don't feel any pain in my body and I can move, I can walk, I'm mobile, I feel very successful. And I think that is the main thing for me now.
Yeah.
Everything else, it doesn't matter. Even if you have money, you could lose it, you could earn it back.
Exactly.
You have friends, you could lose them, you can have them back. You have a relationship, you get divorced. I mean, you can build everything back.
Yes.
Your business, your career, but health, that's like the only thing that if you have it all right now, you are the most successful person. That's what I
completely
feel.
agree. You know the saying that a healthy person has many desires, but
Yes.
somebody who's not healthy
sick
has,
man
only,
has only one.
has only one desire. Yes, I think there's a lot of truth and a lot of wisdom in that.
Speaking of health, you're very active. You've been training for marathons and you've climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. What's the driving force behind that? Why?
I wasn't a particularly active child. Same into teenage years, same into adulthood. And like everybody, we sort of had these New Year resolutions and then we'll go, run around a little bit, go to the gym a little bit. But I actually didn't start running until I was 49. And it happened really late in life. And the impetus for that really was actually to raise funds and awareness for mental health. Charity we were supporting, and the idea was to actually hike to Everest Base Camp. I sort of look at sort of body, mind, and spirit. Body, great. In fact, there have been studies done by Brigham Young University that have showed that people who run actually are at 9 years biologically younger than their actual age. 9 is a big number. And then they redid that study and they found that, actually the number is 12, right? So you get to add 12 years to your age. And it's a bit the point that you were saying, if we have health, we can do all the other things that we want to do. If we don't have health, then we can't do anything else. So that's the body part, physical. Mind, I think it really helps me with mental clarity. I've got so many ideas that come to me when I'm out there running or in nature on a walk, just because I think it helps to center my thoughts, center my emotions, and gives me a bit of that clarity. On the spirit dimension, I think it's really about resilience. When you're sort of hiking up, doing something really difficult physically, and to me, Kilimanjaro was certainly very difficult because I am, like I said, I am actually quite a normal, average person, contrary to perception. But when you push yourself to do things that you didn't think you could, and it's through sheer willpower that you're willing yourself to put one foot in front of the other, that really builds resilience at a very gut level, right? So I think these are reasons that I, keep getting up, keep getting out there, because I find that it's been really beneficial, life-changing.
My passion is yoga. And
Wonderful.
I struggle to wake up early in the morning, but when I started doing yoga, I would wake up at 6:30 a.m. to go for a 7 a.m. class. This is something that a yogi had said, because I like hot yoga.
Okay.
And hot yoga is intense. A lot of people
Yes.
don't like it because
It's uncomfortable.
it's uncomfortable.
Yes.
You're struggling to
Yes.
breathe. You're doing these
Yeah.
uncomfortable poses,
Yeah.
which, the body and the mind is saying, stop, just
Yeah.
go to bed. And he had said, don't adjust the environment to suit you. When you're on your mat, adjust what's inside you to suit the environment. And this was like more than 10 years ago when I was like struggling and sweating. And that concept I've actually brought with me to everything else in my life, that life is going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. It's going to have challenges. You're going to have people who try and tear you down, people who try and take things from you. And I remember when I was in a situation where it was pretty toxic. And I remember that lesson, that don't let myself spiral into that. Control what's in my mind so that I feel in control of the environment. And I found it to be very powerful. And as you said, it really brought up the resilience, that it doesn't matter what you throw at me, I'll just control what's going on inside so that I can respond in the way that I want. So it was interesting, right? You wouldn't think doing a physical activity would give you that kind of spiritual and mental strength. Let's talk about failure. Mm-hmm. Was there the biggest failure or setback that you went through that gave you the biggest life lesson?
I think there've been loads. I mean, if you go through life without failure, you probably haven't lived. Like in one of my leadership classes, we have people sort of do a lifeline exercise that talks about the highs and the lows. And I tell people, if you only got highs, there's something not quite right. So obviously we've got lows. One of the most difficult things I think as a leader to do is actually to make decisions around people. Mm-hmm. Particularly when the fit isn't quite right or they aren't quite performing at the level that they are. one of the biggest failures was probably waiting too long to make some of these decisions. Because actually that did not do the organization or the team any favors, and it actually didn't do that person any favors either. So I think the ability to have that kind of honest conversation with somebody about the fit around the role and that person sooner rather than later is a lesson that I've taken with me. And the way I have reframed that is actually, it's not because anyone was a bad person, but sometimes it wasn't the right fit. I mean, more often than not, it's not the right fit. And I truly do believe that we each have our talents and that we can apply to different places. But if you put a square peg in a round hole, it just doesn't work well for anyone. And so being able to frame it in that way has invariably made it easier for me to have that kind of conversation.
What concerns you most now?
I would say the ability to bring diverse perspectives together without fracturing. When I say that, I guess I mean when I look around the world that we live in today, there are a lot of fractures that look like they are very difficult to mend. And it's a little bit like it takes a long time to build trust, but it takes a second to erode that trust. And what I am concerned about is if we get to situations where people are so rooted in particular beliefs, principles, that they lose the ability to see things from other people's perspectives, and then different camps start digging in and not being able to align and drive consensus. I think that can be very damaging to families, to teams, to organizations, to countries, to the world at large. So I would say that this is what concerns me the most.
And what can be done about it?
You know, I think there's a lot to be said about how we help people go through I guess probably from young education, the ability to understand different perspectives. I do think that part of that comes from exposure to diversity in all forms, because when you sort of see, well, that person is not like me, or this environment is not like the one that I grew up in, you start to appreciate that my reality is not the same as everybody else's reality. So I think that immersion in environments that we're not familiar with are very valuable. It comes back to, you know, being comfortable, being uncomfortable, right? Which is why I think, and it doesn't have to be geographical. It can be, you know, sort of spending time overseas in an uncomfortable environment, I think is great for learning, particularly at a young age. But it's also being in environments that we're not accustomed to. So I think once we have that deep immersion and we sort of learn how to think critically, to be open.
What do you fear that people will find out about you?
Regardless of what level we are or who we, you know, what kind of roles we hold, at least for myself, there still always is some element of questioning and self-doubt. Not in a bad way, I would say. So that's what I mean by I'm not sure it's a fear, because I actually think it's healthy. I think if we completely lack any doubt, it suggests perhaps also a lack of critical thinking against ourselves, and maybe that leads to arrogance. That notwithstanding, I think there are always moments, at least for me, that I pause and I sort of say, hang on, is that right? Am I ready for this? Actually, a little bit of that self-doubt is also what spurs us and motivates us to keep going as well. Right? So whether it is physically or mentally or career-wise or whatever it is, I do have moments of self-doubt.
very often high achievers and growth-oriented individuals have that sense of self-doubt very often. Sometimes they call it imposter syndrome.
Sure, yep.
But I think most of the time it's like that self-doubt comes when you're not sure what the outcome is going to be when you move in a certain direction or take a certain decision. But it's that willingness to go into uncomfortable spaces
Yeah.
and to take certain risks. People who just want to stay safe where they are, they're
would
not going to move forward.
would never be uncomfortable.
Yeah, would
I
not be
guess so.
uncomfortable and would never move forward. So it always very often is people who are, high achievers who have that healthy dose of self-doubt. So you're in good company. So you speak a lot and you do keynote talks as well. How do you prepare for that to show up with presence and confidence?
To me, it's very much about focusing on the audience. So one of the things that's really important for me is to understand the audience that I'm working with, whether it's an audience of 25 people or thousands of people, because I do tailor every session to the needs of the audience. Because at the end of the day, a keynote speech is not so much about a performance as it is about what kind of impact we want to have on those people. And I guess maybe it goes back to my early musical training. I started out as a pianist, right? And as a pianist, yeah, of course you're performing at some level, but actually at the end of the day, being a musician is about how do people feel when you play the particular piece of music. So how do you convey that emotion? So for me, when I think about presence, I think about the audience and what is it that I can give to them. Back to the point about time being the most precious thing, they'll never get that time back, right? So how can I make good use of their time to have some impact on them so that they walk away thinking, well, maybe there's something that I can do differently. Maybe there's some way that I can go out and, transform myself, my organization, my home, my life, whatever it is, so that they can need to take that back and internalize it.
When you go on stage often, you become prominent. Do you find that's helped you or hindered you?
Well, I think it's a double-edged sword. I think if somebody's prominent, I think we need to be responsible for our behaviors, our actions in public, on social media, crossing the street, whatever, right? So there's a certain responsibility that comes with prominence. At the same time, I do think there's also an opportunity with prominence to be able to have an impact, right? So I think it's being mindful of both those dimensions in both its positive form as well as those aspects that we need to watch out for.
Prominence is a very useful tool, a very useful resource. It opens doors for you without having to, knock on them. But it can also reveal parts of you that you may not want people to know, and leaves you very exposed. So I think before anyone goes and gets prominence, which it happens too easily in the social media age, people think, oh, I'm going to post videos, go on social media and get famous and get free things. That's the other side of it that they haven't really thought through or were not aware that it's a huge responsibility, and that means you're even more accountable for everything you do. And many people are not ready for that, and that's when they don't handle it well, and then they get mental challenges because they were looking at the good parts and not prepared for the other parts that come with it.
Yeah, two thoughts come to mind. One is in the words of the great philosopher Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility. So I think the more prominent one is, the more responsibility we have to use it for good. But I would say the other thought is, to your point, being prominent does require the ability to deal with the visibility. When you have that kind of visibility, and you can't control your environment, but all sorts of people will think all sorts of things, good, bad, indifferent, and there are all kinds of keyboard warriors out there who make all kinds of comments, some of which can be hurtful, but again, you can't control your environment. So to put yourself into such an environment, I think it's important to feel that you're ready for it and that you are willing, for whatever reason, to do it because your purpose is bigger than the sacrifice that may come from putting yourself in such a situation, which is why I come back to, I think prominence is an outcome of wanting to achieve something, and therefore it is it's a trade-off that one is willing to make.
What are you most excited about now?
One is I continue to look at the theme of reinvention, and I'm doing some research into that at the moment. The reason for that is because I think structurally, as societies and as economies and demographics would suggest the same, we have a constant need to reinvent ourselves professionally, personally. But as we sort of alluded to earlier, it's not always easy because we get to prominence, perhaps in a particular domain, by being very deep, and then crossing over to something else is not automatically a straightforward task. So one of the things I'm working on is, together with my community, but separately from that, doing some research on what is it that it takes to actually help people get through this phase. And it's going to be multiple phases in life, actually. I am also excited about running my third full marathon in Sydney.
That is exciting. How are you feeling about that?
In theory, having done it twice, I should feel like I can do it a third time, right? But back to the point about self-doubt, it's still daunting, the thought of it. Trust the process, put in the time, put in the effort, and hope for good weather.
I haven't had a chance to speak in depth with you too often, even though I've heard about you from, so long ago. But chatting with you today, there's so much more I want to learn from you, because you've thought so deeply into many key issues that we all need to know and understand. Things like leadership, things like reinvention of ourselves. And that happens not just when you're in your 40s or 50s, but something that happens actually the moment you start interacting with many other adults.
Yes.
And even things like, like what you do, the health, the marathons, the constant renewal. There's so many, brilliant concepts that you've opened my mind to. The other one was being a super connector and putting yourself in different environments and different groups of people just to expand your experience of life. I can't wait to learn more from you, and I really thank you for being here. Thank you for being so generous with your insights and your knowledge.
Thank you, Georgina. This is a real pleasure. Thank you for the gift of your time as well.
I want to ask you to draw out your life in a timeline.
I got involved in lots of extracurricular activities, and at one point was basically in charge of leading the school band, which is like, as I think back about it, like 150, 200 people at 15 years old, and they're all teenagers. Think about it, it sounds pretty mental. So anyway, but that was sort of a first early lesson in leadership and how do you get people to get things done. I then had the chance to go overseas for further my education. That really sort of opened up my worldview. I then continued on in the U.S. actually with my career, but then made a decision actually to relocate with the company to actually start out the business in Asia. That actually turned out to be a huge learning point and a great success. But at the time, to relocate as a partner starting again was difficult. Would have been easier just to stay doing what I was doing. I then took a sabbatical. I took 3 months, traveled on my own across South America. Great fun. And then I moved back into another role, and then at one point had the proverbial evil boss. I think we all do at some point. So there was an evil boss, which was really bad. But got out of that abyss eventually, remained in the company. In the end, he left and I stayed. So there are ways to deal with evil bosses. Got into my first board role, first non-executive role. Eventually then stepped off full-time executive role, so that's sort of a job transition, and then moved into portfolio life, which is where I'm at now. I think portfolio life has been wonderful, but also lots of new learning. And I think where I am today, I'm feeling really good about where I am at, and definitely looking forward to the future.
Oh, very nice.